In the 1890s, New York was buried under 1,500 tons of horse manure a day, 40,000 gallons of urine, dead horses rotting in the gutters where children played. Every block was a calculation in filth, and the urban planners who could see what was coming saw no way out. The city was choking on its own transport. Then the technology our century condemns as the worst thing for urban air arrived: the automobile. A century ago, it was the cleanest thing that had ever happened to a city. This is how the car became a savior, and what that means for the one outside your window. Picture stepping off a curb in Manhattan in the summer of 1890. The smell would reach you before the visual did. A thick, sweet ammonia rot that settled over the city the way humidity does in July. The streets of New York were not paved in stone. They were paved in manure. By 1894, the city was home to roughly 150,000 working horses. Each one produced between 15 and 35 pounds of waste a day. Multiplied out, that was nearly 1,500 tons of manure on the streets every 24 hours, plus 40,000 gallons of urine. The arithmetic was a kind of municipal horror story. Every hour, 60 tons of filth accumulating somewhere between a cobblestone gutter and the underside of a passing cart. The horses did not last. A draft horse in city service was usually worn out within 3 years. When one collapsed, and they collapsed constantly, it often died in place. In 1880, New York removed roughly 15,000 dead horses from its streets. That was not a crisis year. That was the routine. Children played around the carcasses while the rendering wagons came for them. Where did the carcasses go? Out to Barren Island, a thin strip of land off the Brooklyn shore where the bodies were boiled down into glue, grease, oils, and fertilizer. The smell from the rendering works, by all accounts, was worse than the smell they were trying to fix. The locals called the stretch of shoreline Dead Horse Bay. Bottles from the era's landfill still wash up there today. But the carcasses were only the punctuation. The daily text of life in the city was the manure itself. In rain, the streets turned to brown rivers of slurry that splashed up the long skirts of women walking to market. In dry weather, the manure dried into a fine dust that coated laundry, storefront windows, and the lungs of anyone who lived downwind of a stable. The crossings were the worst of it. At every busy intersection, a crossing sweeper stood waiting, usually a child, often an old person, sometimes a disabled adult too poor for any other work, and, for a gratuity, swept a clean path through the muck for pedestrians. The English journalist Henry Mayhew, in his 1851 study London Labor and the London Poor, described the trade as one step above begging, the last chance to earn what Victorian London called an honest crust. Dickens would immortalize the type 2 years later in Bleak House, with Joe the crossing sweeper as one of the novel's most heartbreaking figures. Joe is a boy so degraded by his station that he cannot tell which of the people stepping over him are real. Joe lives, Joe dies, and Dickens never once suggests the cruelty of his condition is exceptional. It is the city working as designed, and the flies. They bred in the manure, fed on the carcasses, and settled on food at open-air markets and on the lips of sleeping infants. The link between filth and disease was already well understood, even if the bacteriology was not. Infant diarrhea, the leading killer of children under 2 in American cities that summer, was called summer complaint, and it came in waves that tracked the heat and the flies. Typhoid fever came through the water supply, wells and reservoirs contaminated by runoff from stables, and overflowing privies that shared the same drainage ditches as the manure piles. By the late 1880s, the situation was no longer just unpleasant. It was structural. The city needed more horses to handle the growth in deliveries and transit. More horses meant more manure. More manure meant more wagons needed to haul it away. More wagons meant more horses. The system was a closed loop of escalating filth. Manure, once a saleable commodity that farmers paid to collect, had become what economists now call an economic bed, something its producer had to pay to dispose of. In Philadelphia, contractors reportedly piled it into vacant lots until the mounds reached the height of a 4- or 5-story building. In New York, the rendering economy of Barren Island was the only thing standing between the city and a literal landscape of waste. By every measure available to a sanitary engineer in 1890, the trajectory pointed in one direction: up. By the early 1890s, New York had a street cleaning department in name only. The workforce was patronage-based, hired through political machines, paid to show up rarely, and almost never paid to actually clean. The streets showed what that meant. In 1895, a reform mayor named William L. Strong appointed a man who had spent his life obsessed with sanitation. George E. Waring Jr. was a Civil War veteran who had risen to the rank of colonel in the Union Army, commanding the 4th Missouri Volunteer Cavalry in campaigns through the Southwest. After the war, he became a sanitary engineer, designed parts of Central Park's drainage, and wrote one of the first American treatises on modern sewerage. He was in his early 60s, sharp-featured, and notoriously difficult to work with, the kind of man who inspected work boots at random. Waring fired the existing street cleaning workforce. He replaced them with a hand-picked crew wearing white pith helmets, white duck trousers, and white capes that flared at the shoulders like wings. The press nicknamed them the White Wings. They marched to their assignments in military formation. They worked in shifts that kept the streets under continuous patrol, day and night. A captain who caught a man sleeping on the job could dismiss him on the spot. They were required to keep their uniforms clean. The reforms were not subtle. Waring ordered every horse in the city stabled overnight so that the morning's waste could be collected before it hit the streets. He organized the regular removal of manure and carcasses for sale as fertilizer and glue, instituting what was effectively New York's first recycling system. He divided the city into districts and held each foreman personally accountable for what was on his pavement. He installed the first covered garbage cans. He insisted that street sweepers report in writing what they had cleared each shift. The numbers moved. New York's annual death rate fell measurably during Waring's tenure, dropping from the high 20s per thousand before he took office to the low 20s by the end of his second year. In a city of 2 million, that meant several thousand more people alive at the end of each year than at the beginning. Waring himself was not finished. In 1898, after the Spanish-American War broke out, the army asked him to go to Cuba and reorganize the sanitation of Havana, where yellow fever was killing American troops faster than Spanish bullets were. He went. He cleaned the streets, drained the swamps, whitewashed the walls. On October 29, 1898, he died of yellow fever himself, a sanitary engineer killed by the disease his profession had spent a generation trying to abolish. The city honored him with a public funeral. The White Wings marched behind his casket. But here is the part the memorial usually leaves out. Waring almost won. He took a city whose streets were a public nuisance and made them, by 1897, genuinely clean. The crossing sweepers had less to sweep. The flies had less to breed in. The death rate fell. For the first time in anyone's memory, the municipal economy of filth had an enemy with a budget. What Waring did not solve, could not solve, with brooms and white uniforms, was the mountain. As long as the city ran on horses, the volume of manure being produced every day exceeded the volume any team of men could haul away. The White Wings were cleaning faster than the horses were producing. They were just losing the race. This is the part of the story that almost everybody gets wrong. The popular version says that in 1894, the Times of London published a prediction that by 1950, every street in London would be buried under 9 feet of horse manure. The story has been told and retold so often that it has become a kind of origin myth for the automobile. Proof that smart people once failed to see an obvious solution, and that innovation only arrives when the crisis gets bad enough. In 2018, the Times itself walked back the citation. The so-called prediction never appeared in their pages. What was published in a letter dated June 8, 1894, was a complaint about dust and mud, not a forecast of manure burial. The 9-foot line traces to a 2004 essay by an economic historian named Stephen Davies and has been passed off as journalism ever since. The 1898 International Urban Planning Conference in New York that supposedly broke up over the crisis, the one you may have read about, never happened either. The myth is not the problem. The problem is what the myth was trying to dramatize. And the real numbers were worse because the real numbers had no exit. The structural impossibility was this: horses produced manure faster than any system of men, carts, and rendering works could dispose of it. The more horses you added to keep up with the city's growth, the more horses you needed just to haul the previous horses' waste away. Any engineer staring at the math could see the conclusion. By the middle of the century, the equation predicted the streets would be dealing with the problem at a volume that exceeded the combined capacity of every existing disposal route. London faced the same math. By 1900, the city was home to tens of thousands of hansom cabs and horse-drawn buses, each requiring a dozen horses. Tens of thousands more worked the carts and drays that delivered coal, ice, milk, and beer. The output, per square mile, was on the same trajectory as New York's. Paris was worse. Manure, in other words, had stopped being a resource and started being a problem. Farmers who once paid to collect it now refused to come unless the stable owners subsidized the cartage. Stable owners, in turn, paid renderers to take it off their hands. The renderers, finally, dumped it where they could. Into the ocean, onto vacant lots. Into the marshes and creeks that ran along the city's edge. The crisis was not a question of will. It was a question of physics. Every solution that involved more horses produced, on net, more of what the city was trying to remove. And this is where the story, the real one, begins. Henry Ford did not build the Model T to clean the streets. He built it because he believed that the ordinary working family had been locked out of personal mobility for too long. "I will build a motor car for the great multitude," he announced when the Model T went on sale in 1908. "It will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one." The mission, in his telling, was about dignity, about freedom, about the right of a Detroit machinist to drive to his job the way a Detroit banker already did. He was not thinking about manure. Nobody building an automobile in 1908 was thinking about manure. They were thinking about speed, about leisure, about the romance of the open road. But the press of his own time was. A New York editorial from the early years of the horseless carriage celebrated the new machine as noiseless and odorless, a clean break from what it called the noisome stench of the stable. Another writer in the same period called the automobile the great sanitary hope of the age. A third argued that the horseless carriage would do more for the lungs of city children than any public health campaign yet attempted. They were not wrong. The transition, though, was messier than the legend allows. It was not a single decision, but a cascading replacement. And the first wave had nothing to do with Ford. Electric trolleys had begun displacing horse-drawn streetcars in American cities as early as the 1880s, and by the turn of the century, motorized delivery wagons were starting to replace the horse-drawn drays that brought milk and ice to tenement stoops. Ford's assembly line, introduced in 1913, made the Model T cheap enough that within a decade it was crowding the carriage trade. By the 1920s, private automobiles were squeezing the horse out of personal transport, and motorized trucks were doing the same to commercial delivery. The change did not happen in a year. It did not happen in a decade. For 30 years, the two systems ran in parallel. Horse-drawn wagons still shared streets with motorized ones, and the rendering economy of Barren Island continued operating into the 1930s. The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was still campaigning against horse abuse on city streets well into the 1920s. Some cities still kept a working horse for niche work into the 1940s. What the automobile did, and what no sanitary reformer had managed to do, was not just displace the horse. It made the horse economically obsolete. Once a delivery firm could run a single truck where it had previously needed a driver, a horse, and a stable hand. The horse stopped being a rational business choice. The manure that had been an unavoidable byproduct of doing business simply stopped being produced. There is one detail worth pausing on. The gasoline that ran those first engines was, at the time, considered a useless waste byproduct of making kerosene for lamps. The petroleum industry had been trying to get rid of it for years. The automobile turned that waste into the fuel of a new century. By the 1930s, the rendering works on Barren Island were winding down. The mounds and vacant lots were not being replaced. The fly population crashed. Infant diarrhea, the summer complaint that had haunted every American city since the founding of the Republic, fell off the charts. The death rate, which Waring had pushed into the low 20s by 1897, kept falling through the 1920s and 1930s. None of this was what Ford had set out to do. He wanted to democratize the automobile. What he accidentally accomplished was the largest sanitary intervention in the history of urban life. And he did not do it alone. Electric trolleys, motorized trucks, the assembly line, the bicycle, the omnibus on rubber tires, all of them chipped away at the same problem from different angles. But the machine that did the most was the one nobody had set out to build as a sanitation device. The car was the wrong hero. It cleaned the cities anyway. There's a certain vertigo in holding two true things at the same time. The first is that the automobile in the early 20th century did more to clean up American and European cities than any sanitation reform, any sewer system, any public health campaign yet attempted. The flyborne and waterborne diseases that had killed children by the tens of thousands went into retreat as the horse went out of production. White wings and dead horse wagons gave way to a different kind of street traffic entirely. The crossing sweepers disappeared from the curbs of Manhattan. The manure mounds disappeared from vacant lots in Philadelphia. Dead Horse Bay stopped being a place where horses were rendered and became, eventually, a quiet stretch of shoreline where bottles from the old landfill still wash up after storms. The second is that the same machine, 100 years later, has become the thing cities are struggling to live with again. Take Ford at his word. His stated mission in 1908 was mobility for the great multitude. He did not write that mission to clean the streets, and he did not write it knowing what the car would eventually become. A man who built the first mass-market car and who died in 1947 still believing the automobile was a democratizing force would not have recognized the modern city at first glance. He would have seen the freeways and the traffic and the air that children were breathing in the worst affected neighborhoods, and he would have had to think for a long time before he knew what to call it. We are not, of course, watching a city buried in manure. The flies are gone. The dead horses are gone. The summer complaint that killed so many infants in 1890 is, for most of us, a phrase in a textbook. But the structure of the problem has returned. A technology that once dissolved a crisis has, over 100 years, become a different one. The answer of one century has revealed itself, slowly, as the question of the next. This is not a verdict on the automobile. The car was not virtuous when it was cleaning cities, and it is not vicious now that it is straining them. It is what it has always been. The most consequential infrastructure of the modern city, asked to do more than infrastructure alone can bear. The crisis is not the machine. The crisis is the math. The same kind of closed loop the sanitary engineers of 1890 were staring at, where the solution to a problem produces, on net, more of what the city is trying to remove. There is a quieter lesson underneath all of this. The crossing sweeper has not disappeared. He has just moved to a different corner, holding a different tool, doing the same job. Every age gets the street cleaner it can afford, and every street cleaner eventually has to give way to whatever comes next. The automobile cleaned the cities of the 1900s. What cleans the cities of the 2020s is a question no one has finished answering. In the 1890s, a sanitary engineer who had inherited a city drowning in its own transport might have looked at the forecasts and concluded that the only way out was to stop using horses. He would have been right. He would have been almost alone. We are not in a different century. We are in a different version of the same century. The closed loop is the same. A technology that solves one crisis produces on net the conditions for the next. The math is the same. The shape of the problem is the same. The only thing that has changed is what the city is trying to remove. The question was never whether the automobile was good or bad. The question was what problem the automobile was the answer to. In 1890, the answer was filth. In our century, the answer is pollution. Same machine, different century, same shape of problem waiting to be solved. What's the cleanest, quietest piece of old infrastructure your city has ever torn out? And what replaced it? Tell me in the comments. If origin stories like this are why you subscribe, hit the button. New episodes every day.